The identity of the Antichrist has, for better or worse, been the topic of a lot of discussion and debate over the years. Because of this, we got several lines of thought trying to uncover where this demonic figure will come from. This is the first part of a four-part series that goes over the main perspectives of this topic. We'll go over Jewish origins, the Muslim origins, and finally, the Gentile origins. Once we're done, I'll share my thoughts as to which one of these theories holds the most weight. So, let's get started with Jewish origins. Several cryptic passages have been interpreted to suggest the Antichrist will come from Israel. Proponents of this theory point to hints scattered through the Bible. The first, the tribe of Dan, a serpent by the road. In Genesis 49, Jacob blesses his sons and says, "Dan shall be a serpent by the way, that bites the horse's heels." Early interpreters saw more than a poetic metaphor here. Notably, the 3rd century theologian Hippolytus argued the serpent was Antichrist himself, a deceiver arising from the tribe of Dan. As Hippolytus put it, in naming the tribe of Dan, Jacob declared clearly the tribe from which Antichrist is destined to spring. For as Christ springs from the tribe of Judah, so Antichrist is to spring from the tribe of Dan. Like Moses' blessing, Dan is a lion's whelp in Deuteronomy 33:22, was read as a cryptogram for the fierce false Messiah from the tribe of Dan. 2. Dan omitted in Revelation. Supporting this, readers note that the tribe of Dan is curiously omitted from the list of the 12 tribes sealed in Revelation 7. Church Father Irenaeus in the 2nd century connected the dots. He cited Jeremiah 8:16. We hear the snorting of his horses from Dan as a clue, the tribe from which Antichrist shall come. Dan's exclusion from the 144,000 Israelites in Revelation, Irenaeus says, is for this reason, because Dan would produce the betrayer, not the redeemed. This early interpretation turned Dan's tribal symbol, a snake, into a banner of the Antichrist. 3. The Temple of God in 2 Thessalonians. The Apostle Paul foretold a man of lawlessness who takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. You can see 2 Thessalonians 2:4. Early Christians universally understood the temple of God to mean the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. Since Paul wrote this after the original temple was destroyed, believers inferred that Antichrist will facilitate its rebuilding, positioning himself as a false messiah to the Jews. This idea goes hand in hand with a Jewish Antichrist. Who else could plausibly be received in a rebuilt Jerusalem temple? In fact, a common refrain in early commentaries was that Antichrist would actually rebuild the temple and restore it and give it over to the Jews. This dramatic gesture would help him seduce many of the Jewish people by fulfilling their political messianic aspirations. 4. I have come in my Father's name. In John chapter 5, verse 43, Jesus warned, I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. If another comes in his own name, him you will receive. Many see this as Jesus foreshadowing Israel's tragic future acceptance of a false Messiah. The 4th century bishop John Chrysostom made exactly this connection. He told his congregation that since the Jews rejected the true Christ, much more ought they not to believe in Antichrist. For Christ said, if another shall come in his own name, him you will receive. In other words, Christ's prophecy in John 5:43 was interpreted as Israel one day embracing the Antichrist, an impostor coming in his own name. 5. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers. Some interpreters point to a phrase about an end-times tyrant in Daniel 11:37. He shall pay no regard to the God of his fathers. If the God of his fathers refers to the God of Israel, this could imply the Antichrist is born of Israelite lineage, but turns away from the faith of his forefathers. While the original context of this verse likely described Antiochus Epiphanes, and we'll get into him in another video, later readers applied it to Antichrist and saw in it an allusion to Jewish ancestry, an apostate Jew who regards no God but himself. This clue is more speculative, but it has been used to bolster the profile of a Jewish-born Antichrist who betrays even the God of his heritage. Taken together, these biblical hints created a jigsaw puzzle. Early Christians sincerely believed they saw a picture emerging, the Antichrist as a Jew, likely from Dan's lineage, who will pose as Israel's Messiah, court the Jewish people, and even rebuild the temple, only to betray and defile it. As we mentioned a little bit before, many early Christian writers explicitly taught that the Antichrist would be Jewish. This wasn't a fringe idea, it was practically mainstream in the first few centuries AD. Irenaeus was one of the first to write about Antichrist's ancestry. He clearly identified the tribe of Dan as the Antichrist's origin. Irenaeus tied together Jeremiah's warning about the sound of horses from Dan with Dan's absence in Revelation's list, concluding that the Antichrist shall come from Dan, and that this tribe was left unmentioned among the saved because of that destiny. He also affirmed the Jewish temple as the site of Antichrist's enthronement. Quote, "The temple in Jerusalem was made by direction of the true God, in which the enemy shall sit, endeavoring to show himself as Christ." To Irenaeus, Antichrist was not a Roman or a pope or purely a spirit of evil. He was an apostate, setting aside idols to persuade men that he himself is God in the holy city, a false Jewish king empowered by the devil. Hippolytus of Rome was a student of Irenaeus, and he took his mentor's ideas and ran with them, writing the earliest surviving treatise on the Antichrist. He doubled down on the tribe of Dan theory, saying, as Christ springs from Judah, so Antichrist is to spring from Dan. Hippolytus marshaled Genesis 49:17 and Deuteronomy 33:22 as prophecies of this Danite origin. He also noted that the Savior and Antichrist are mere opposites. The Savior was manifested as a lamb. Antichrist will appear as a lamb on the outside while being a wolf within. The Savior came into the world in the circumcision, and he will come in the same manner. The Lord raised up his holy flesh as a temple, and Antichrist will raise a temple of stone in Jerusalem. Hippolytus believed Antichrist will mimic Christ's ministry in every detail, including being born of the Jewish people in the circumcision and performing signs in Jerusalem. In another work, possibly by Hippolytus or a contemporaneous source, we're told, above all, Antichrist will love the nation of the Jews, working false miracles among them, and after that he will build the temple in Jerusalem and give it over to the Jews. This vivid picture shows the early church expected a personal deceiver who presents himself as the Jewish Messiah and woos Israel with a rebuilt temple and messianic deeds. The idea of a Jewish Antichrist didn't stop with Irenaeus and Hippolytus. It became a kind of tradition in Christian eschatology. Church historian Bernard McGinn notes that Origen, Chrysostom, Jerome, and likely Augustine all continued the early church tradition that the Antichrist was to be of Jewish descent. For example, Origen in the 3rd century taught that Antichrist would come as a pretender Messiah among the Jews, though, to be fair, Origen often allegorized prophecy. St. John Chrysostom, who we mentioned earlier in the 4th century, explicitly warned that the Jews, having rejected Christ, would be deceived by the Antichrist, as evidenced by John 5:43. St. Jerome in the late 4th century, who knew Hebrew learning, wrote in his commentary on Daniel that Dan shall judge his people. Genesis 49:16 was fulfilled not only in Samson, but ultimately in Antichrist, the false judge from Dan, echoing the same tribal notion. By Jerome's time, the notion that Antichrist would be a Jew from the tribe of Dan who sets himself up in a rebuilt Jewish temple was commonplace. Even into the early medieval period, this belief held sway. The early medieval sermons, Pseudo-Ephraim and others, presumed a Jewish Antichrist as a given. It wasn't really until much later in the medieval ages and Reformation that alternative views like a Roman Antichrist or other identifications became more popular. So why did the early Christians so readily assume a Jewish origin for Antichrist? Scholars suggest that it was partly a reaction to Jewish expectations. The Jews of the 1st and 2nd centuries were still awaiting a Messiah, which Christians viewed as a dangerous rejection of Jesus. Thus, as one academic puts it, the continued Jewish expectation of a Messiah after Jesus came was interpreted by Christians in the 2nd century as a foreboding of the coming of an Antichrist. In other words, the very fact that Judaism anticipated another Messiah was seen as setting the stage for the false Messiah. Irenaeus and company, amid frequent disputes with Jewish contemporaries, essentially warned, the Messiah you're waiting for is actually going to be the Antichrist. This polemical context helps explain why the theory of a Jewish Antichrist took hold so strongly in early Christian thought. It was a way to reconcile biblical prophecy with the reality that many Jews did not accept Jesus, casting that future Jewish leader in the worst possible role. From the pieces we've examined, it's clear why the notion of a Jewish Antichrist has persisted in theology and imagination. The Bible's own passages, though enigmatic, provided seeds for the idea. A serpent from Dan, a man of sin in the temple, hints of a deceiver whom Israel might unwittingly welcome. By the 3rd century, Christian writers painted a vivid scenario of Antichrist, a false Jewish Messiah performing miracles, rebuilding Jerusalem's temple, and beguiling many until Christ returns to destroy him. Meanwhile, Jewish writings themselves, through their own lens, acknowledged the danger of deceivers and spoke of an end-times anti-Messiah. You can look up Armilus, showing that both faiths expected a final clash between a pretender and the true Redeemer. In a way, the Christian and Jewish narratives are opposites that mirror each other. Christians feared a Jewish Antichrist, Jewish legend feared a Christian Roman anti-Messiah. As we finish, picture the dramatic irony envisioned by those early believers. The ultimate enemy masquerading as a son of David, welcomed by the very nation that awaited salvation. It's a chilling and fascinating twist in the apocalyptic saga, one that has kept scholars and storytellers pondering for centuries. Whether or not one agrees, the legend of the Jewish Antichrist remains a powerful narrative at the crossroads of two great religious traditions, illustrating how each has viewed the enigma of evil in the age to come. And in the end, perhaps that's the real takeaway. Our interpretations of prophecy often say as much about our present hopes and fears as they do about the future. The theory of a Jewish Antichrist underscores the early Christian hope that no impostor, no matter how convincing, can ultimately triumph. For when the true Messiah returns, the deception will be exposed and the truth will win out over the grandest lie. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please like, subscribe, and share it with others. Also, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Stay tuned for part 2 of this series where we discuss the Muslim origin theory. God bless and be excellent to each other.